Let's have a look at the newest enemy added to the game, the Merchant. He moves quickly and gives the player the biggest gold reward of any enemy when killed. But unlike the other enemies that run horizontally towards the castle to attack, the Merchant runs vertically up and down the screen and despawns when he reaches the other side. My goal in introducing these vertical neutral enemies was to give the player more options and also to create a risk-reward scenario, forcing the player to choose between keeping their castle safe and maximizing their gold by targeting the merchants. Adding variety to the enemy movement has given me some ideas that I'd like to experiment with, but for this video, I just wanted to show you how the merchant went from an idea to a fully functional part of the game. Just about everything with its own behavior in the game is an actor. This meant the first step to implementing the merchant was adding a new entry to the actor ID enum and creating a new prefab to match. I'm using this worker model, which, like most things in the game, comes from the Toon RTS Units pack on the Unity Asset Store. The model also comes with a bag attachment that I thought was a perfect fit for the merchant. Next, I needed to set up the animations. And I also love the running animation with the bag over his shoulder. It's a perfect fit and exactly what I had in mind. With the prefab and animations sorted, it was time to start testing. The first step here was to add a new button to the debug menu to spawn a merchant. I really can't recommend a debug menu highly enough. They're super simple to implement, and they've saved me countless hours by speeding up testing, especially in scenarios that can be awkward or time-consuming to recreate. Like just about everything in game dev, things didn't work perfectly on the first try. The first test failed because I hadn't updated the enemy spawning code to include the merchant, and the second test failed because I forgot to configure the animator on the prefab. After fixing these issues, the third attempt was a success, and the merchant was up and running just like the rest of the enemies. Now that the merchant was functional, the next step was to introduce vertical movement and implement it in a way where I could easily configure enemies to run in either direction. To get started, I gave each enemy a movement type of either horizontal or vertical. I then took all the values I was using for spawning enemies and wrapped them inside a spawn settings struct. I also modified the enemy spawning code to use the spawn settings and made sure everything was still working as expected with a quick playtest. Again, the debug menu was a big time saver here, since I could just spawn each enemy up front without needing to wait for them to spawn naturally. Next, it was time to add the vertical spawn settings, and this was a case where sometimes the quick and dirty way is all you need. To find the right spawn positions, all I did was create a cube, drag it to where I wanted to spawn the vertical enemies, and recorded the positions. With the vertical spawn settings defined, I needed to modify the enemy spawning code again to use both sets of spawn settings, depending on the movement type of the enemy being spawned. It was at this point that a playtest revealed a pretty fundamental issue. All of the enemies so far were working under the assumption that they had an attack target that they were moving towards, but this wasn't the case for vertical enemies. They instead needed a target position, so they could run to the other side of the screen before despawning. This meant a bit of a rework to support both target positions and target actors. The actor state machine is getting pretty messy at this point, but that's somewhat expected since the requirements of the game have changed over time. It's near the top of my list for things that need cleaning up, but my general approach is to leave it as it is until it's actually causing issues, or until it becomes so messy that adding new behavior becomes impossible. With the target position rework done, another playtest showed some success, with the merchant successfully spawning and running vertically across the screen, as well as giving a gold reward when killed. The next step was to make the merchants despawn, since currently they would just stand there once they reach their target position. This was an easy change for now, but it's something I'll definitely need to revisit, since I'm sure there will be cases where I don't want an enemy to despawn once they reach their target position. Now that the spawn positions were different between horizontal and vertical enemies, I wanted to separate the spawn rates as well. This would let me treat horizontal and vertical enemies as two different waves that would spawn independently. I'm not sure if I'll keep this design moving forwards, but I'd at least like to experiment with it for now. This needed another refactor in much the same way as the spawn settings, but this time for the wave settings. I renamed the wave settings I already had to horizontal wave settings, and then created another version called vertical wave settings. After updating the enemy spawning code to use the correct wave settings for the enemy's movement type, it was time for a final playtest. Well, it would have been, except I nearly caused a disaster. Because I had renamed the wave settings variable, all of its values in the inspector were wiped. Normally I would write them down or take a screenshot, but this time I completely forgot. Luckily, version control made this an easy fix. I was able to put aside all my changes using git stash, which restored the original values and let me take note of them. Then I brought back all my changes with git stash pop and filled in the wiped values with the ones I'd written down. This is a great example of why using scriptable objects for data like this is a good idea. In that case, renaming the variable would have only wiped the reference to the scriptable object, which is a simple click and drag to restore. With disaster averted and all the functionality implemented, it was time to give the merchant some final testing. I did a few playtests, trying to find some numbers that felt nice and matched the risk-reward ratio I was aiming for. I'm sure the balance will change over time as I keep adding features and getting more user feedback, but they feel okay for now. So that's about it for implementing the merchant. As you can see, adding new features is really straightforward, and you're all but guaranteed to run into a few road bumps along the way. But it's all part of the process of building a game, so all you can really do is accept it and keep moving forwards. If you'd like to see more videos like this, or have any suggestions for what I should add to the game, go ahead and leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.